They would say afterward, in the drawing rooms of 3 counties, that the Duke of Renfield ruined his own marriage in the time it takes a footman to refill a glass, and that the Duchess thanked him for it, with a curtsy so correct it could have been framed and hung in the long gallery beside the portraits of women who had survived worse men with less grace. But on the night itself, the last night of October, with Renfield Hall lit from cellar to attic, and 80 guests turning beneath chandeliers that had not all been lit at once since the old Duke's day, only a dozen people actually heard the words, and not one of them ever forgot the particular quality of the silence that came after. The musicians were between sets. The card-room had emptied for supper. And Edmund, 7th Duke of Renfield, stood beside the widowed Lady Cordelia Fanshawe at the edge of the great room, and looked across it at his wife of 2 years, who was wearing the Renfield sapphires he himself had ordered sent up to her room that morning, and said, in the flat, carrying voice of a man reciting policy rather than feeling, "Take nothing of mine." He did not shout it. That was the worst of it. The servants agreed later, below stairs, where the truth of a great house is kept like root vegetables, cool and out of the light. A shout can be forgiven as weather. This was delivered the way a steward reads out a notice of eviction, courteously, with the date already fixed. Eleanor, Duchess of Renfield, stood very still for the length of one breath. Those nearest her would swear the candlelight did not so much as tremble against the stones at her throat. Then she inclined her head, precisely as deep as courtesy required, and not 1 degree deeper, and said, "As you wish, your grace," and the words were so quiet and so level that half the room believed the matter must have been trivial, some small business of household accounts, and went back gratefully to their wine. They were wrong about it being trivial. They were right about the accounts. If you have ever been made to feel like a guest in your own life, if you have ever stood in a room you had tended and warmed and kept, and been informed by the look on one particular face that you had somehow been caught borrowing all of it, the chair, the fire, the very name you answered to, then you already understand exactly what the Duchess understood in that one breath of stillness. And you will not need the rest of this story explained to you so much as confirmed. If you know that feeling, tell me in the comments where in the world you are listening from, and stay with me. Because what this quiet woman did next was not what the room expected, and it was not what the Duke expected, and it took him the better part of a year to understand that it was not revenge at all, but obedience, which is a far more terrible thing to receive from a woman you have wronged. She did not leave the ball. That should be recorded plainly, because the story as it is told in some houses has her sweeping out with her train hissing on the marble, and nothing of the kind occurred, sweeping being a form of speech in the Duchess having just been relieved of the obligation to say anything at all. She remained another hour and 40 minutes. She partnered old Sir John Averell, who was deaf in the left ear and delighted with her. She complimented the vicar's daughter on her playing. She stood for a quarter of an hour not 6 feet from Lady Cordelia Fanshawe and discussed the difficulty of keeping roses through a wet autumn with such flawless composure that Cordelia, who had constructed this entire evening the way an engineer constructs a bridge load by load, began for the first time to suspect that something in her calculations had failed to carry. At 1:30 the Duchess bade her guests good night at the foot of the stairs, because she was the hostess, and that was the hostess's place, and she went up to her rooms with her candle, and the great house folded itself down into darkness behind her, and nobody understood yet that anything had happened. It was her maid, Betsy, who understood first, because it was Betsy who was asked at 2 in the morning to unclasp the Renfield sapphires and to fetch the flat leather case they lived in, and to carry the case that same night to his Grace's valet with the Duchess's compliments. The stones went back into their case with a small cold rattle, like the first handful of earth on a coffin lid. Betsy, who was 19 and loyal to the marrow, said afterward that she had begun to cry, and that the Duchess had not, and that somehow this had made it worse, my lady standing there in her ball dress at the mirror with her throat bare, saying in a perfectly kind voice, "Don't, Betsy. Nothing has happened tonight except an instruction, and I intend to follow it exactly." There is a particular stillness that belongs to a woman who has finally stopped hoping, and it is often mistaken by the people who caused it for peace. By 6 o'clock, before the fires were laid, the Duchess was in the estate office at the back of the house, where she was not supposed to be, and where she had in fact spent some part of nearly every day of her married life. The great ledger of Renfield lay open on the standing desk, October's page, in her own small upright hand, because it had been her hand in that book for a year and a half, ever since Mr. Pruitt's eyes had begun to fail him, and the Duke had noticed nothing. She read the open page once, the way a departing tenant looks over a field she has just finished harvesting for a landlord who never walked it. Then she drew off her wedding ring, and she set it down in the centre of the page, on the entry for the lower hay drainage, where the figures were hers, and the improvements were hers, and the money, though no one upstairs knew it yet, had also been hers. She did not leave a letter. A letter would have been taking a sheet of his paper. Those who think this pettiness misunderstand her entirely, and the Duke, to his credit, was never among them. When he stood in that office 9 hours later with the ring in his palm, he understood the message with perfect accuracy, because it was written in the only language the two of them had ever truly shared, which was the language of accounts. The entry said, "Paid in full." The ring said, "and nothing owing." She took her own trunk, the small brown corded one she had brought from her father's house, and she took her mother's thin gold chain, which as of the previous spring carried no locket, for reasons that belong a little later in this story. And she took the £41 that remained of her own mother's legacy, hers by settlement, counted out, and not a shilling more. Mrs. Tally, the housekeeper, weeping frankly, offered the small closed carriage as far as Harcaster at least, and was refused with a gentleness that ended the discussion. The Renfield carriages had the Renfield arms on the doors. Instead, the gardener's boy was sent down to the Rose and Crown, and at 8 o'clock on the first morning of November, in a hired gig smelling of straw and harness oil, driven by an ostler who had no idea who she was, the Duchess of Renfield went down the long avenue between the bare limes, past the gatehouse, out of the tall iron gates. And she did not look back at the house. Not once. Though the ostler said she sat as straight as church. Only one thing more, and only Betsy ever knew it, because Betsy had hidden herself weeping in the gig behind the luggage and been allowed at the last to stay. 2 miles beyond the gates, where the road turns at Millthorpe and the chimneys of Renfield Hall drop finally out of sight behind the shoulder of the down. The Duchess pressed the back of her bare left hand hard against her mouth, once, for the space of perhaps 3 heartbeats. Then she folded both hands in her lap and asked Betsy, in a voice you could have set a watch by, whether she had remembered to pack the small workbox. She had taken nothing of his. She had been exact about it. To understand what the Duke thought he was doing when he said those 5 words, and he did think, in the way that frightened men think, quickly and backward, the story must go back 2 years to the marriage itself, which the county had never managed to explain to its own satisfaction. Edmund of Renfield was 31 then, handsome in the dark, unforthcoming way of his line, master of 11,000 acres, and known from one end of the shire to the other as a man who counted. Not a miser, the word was never miser. His table was good and his subscriptions were paid, but a man who watched, who kept accounts in his head at dinner, who could tell you what a kindness had cost him down to the last civility. And Eleanor Winslow was the daughter of a Harcaster wool merchant, a man who had been substantial once, whose name had been good on any exchange paper in the north until a partner he loved, like a brother, took the firm's capital into a canal speculation and took himself to Boulogne when it failed. Thomas Winslow paid what the law required, and then, because he was that kind of man, kept paying what it did not, and it broke his health, and it left his only daughter at 26 with a small legacy from her dead mother, a head for figures that 3 clerks together could not match, and no prospects that anyone in Harcaster could name aloud without wincing. The marriage was arranged the way a wall is built between 2 properties, by agreement and for practical reasons, with both parties present at the survey. The Duke required a duchess, an heir in due course, and a wife who would ask him for nothing, his own word, nothing, spoken across the lawyer's table, with the settlements lying between them. And Miss Winslow, who had watched her father be devoured precisely because he had trusted largely and asked gently, looked back at this cold, careful, unhappy man, and recognized the terms as honest, which was more than she could say for most of what had been offered her. Her father's remaining debts were quietly retired. Her mother's legacy was secured to her alone, pin money and a little capital, hers absolutely, and this mattered to her in a way the Duke never troubled to ask about. She signed her maiden name for the last time, Eleanor Winslow, in the vestry book of Harcaster Church on a wet March morning, and became a duchess before the ink of the old name was dry. What the county could not see, because the county was watching the front of the house, was what these 2 people were actually like behind it, which was, for above a year, courteous, distant, and slowly, cautiously, almost warm. She did not ask him for anything. He had been correct about that. It was the only particular in which his bargain was honoured beyond its letter, because what he had failed to put into the contract was everything she would give. Within a season she knew every tenant on the estate by name and half their children. When Mr. Pruitt, the steward, 40 years in the family's service, began holding the ledger at arm's length and then further than his arm could reach, it was the Duchess who began, without announcement, to sit with him in the estate office of a morning. And by Michaelmas the hand in the great book was hers, small and upright, and the arithmetic, Pruitt told the housekeeper with the door shut, was the finest he had seen in 50 years of figures. It was the Duchess who found the error in the corn factor's reckoning that had been quietly bleeding the home farm for a decade. It was the Duchess who walked the sodden bottomland of the lower hay in borrowed pattens, asked old Hodgett why his grandfather's drains had failed, listened to the answer, and drew up the scheme of ditches that dried 40 acres by the following spring. None of this reached the Duke in any form he recognised. He saw only that the estate ran smoother, that Pruitt seemed 10 years younger, that the tenants had begun touching their hats to his wife's gig with an enthusiasm they had never spent on his own carriage, and that his careful, silent house had somewhere acquired a centre of warmth that was not, as it had never been, himself. And here the story must turn to his mother, because no man says take nothing of mine to his own wife in a lit ballroom unless somebody taught him the sentence, and somebody had, patiently, for 30 years. The Dowager Duchess Margaret had come to Renfield as a bride in the last age, and found her husband already spending it, the 6th Duke being one of those charming men who are adored by everyone who does not depend upon them. She watched the oaks of the North Avenue felled for his debts of honour. She watched her jointure renegotiated twice, watched his friends drink the cellar her son should have inherited, and she distilled all of it, year by year, into a single doctrine, which she administered to her boy along with his catechism: everyone who smiles at you is reaching for your pocket. Affection is the pick that opens the lock. Count everything, and count it twice, when the counting is called unkind. The 6th Duke died when Edmund was 19, leaving mortgages like nettles in every field, and the son spent 12 unbroken years pulling them out with his bare hands. And a man who has done that, who has restored with grinding slowness what someone he loved threw away laughing, may come in time to confuse being careful with being safe, and being loved with being robbed. There had been one other teacher. At 23, Edmund had loved, entirely and clumsily, the Honourable Cordelia Vane, as she was then the beauty of 2 seasons, and had been given every encouragement short of a promise, and had ridden to her father's house in the September of his 4th year of mortgage, pulling with his mother's ring in his pocket, arriving, as it happened, 4 days after the announcement of her engagement to the Marquess of Fanshawe, who was 55, gouty, and possessed of 40,000 a year unencumbered. She had smiled at him in her father's hall with real regret, being not cruel, but merely accurate, and said, "You will thank me, Renfield. You could not have afforded me." He had gone home and told his mother she had been right about everything, and the Dowager, God forgive her, had agreed. So that when the Marquess of Fanshawe died obligingly in the spring of this story's 2nd year, and his widow returned to the county with her mourning worn at the very outermost edge of what lilac can decently signify, and began to be everywhere the Duke was, at every table, in every set, always with some small remembered thing from 20 years ago held up to the light between them, the county drew one conclusion, the Dowager drew another and approved it, and the Duchess of Renfield, who missed nothing that could be entered in a column, drew no conclusion at all where anyone could see her do it. She only noted, the way she noted the price of oats, that her husband had begun to be reminded, and that men who are reminded of what a thing once cost will sooner or later be invited to reckon what it is currently worth. The invitation, when it came, was addressed to his oldest fear, and it was written in Cordelia Fanshawe's hand. Because here is the thing that made the 5 words at the ball an amputation and not merely an insult, the thing Eleanor never told anyone and Betsy only guessed. By the 2nd autumn, the Duchess of Renfield had begun, against her own strict bookkeeping, to hope. There had been evidences, small ones entered nowhere, and yet she found she was keeping the account in spite of herself, the way you cannot help counting church bells. In February he had said "we" for the first time. They had been in the estate office over the plans for the new cottages at Millthorpe, his finger on the costing she had drawn up, and he had said, "Not I shall have to consider whether I can afford this, but we can carry the brick if we sell the timber standing," and had gone on speaking as if nothing had happened, while she sat looking at the figures with her ears ringing as though a cannon had been fired in the room. Item 1 In April she had found her father's little treatise on the wool trade, which she had brought in her trunk along with everything else she was, lying on the library table with a paper knife in it at the chapter on carding, and the corners of 11 pages turned down in a man's impatient fashion, and she had stood holding it for a long time. Item 11 pages. Through the summer there had grown up between them the habit of the ledger evenings, Thursdays usually, the two of them on opposite sides of the estate office desk, with the candles burning down and the week's accounts between them. And it was the only room in England where both of them were fluent, and what they spoke there in rents and drainage and the price of lime was not what either of them meant, and both of them knew it, and neither of them dared translate. He would say, "The lower hay figures are better than I hoped, and mean something enormous." She would say, "The house did it, the land only wanted asking, and means something enormous back." And beginning in June, some weeks after a conversation about her habit of reading late, he had taken to leaving the lamp in the library window lit when he retired first, ostensibly because the stairs were treacherous in the dark actually, and the whole silent household knew it, actually for her. And she would come down the passage at midnight and see that small, squandered light burning for no economy that any Renfield doctrine could justify, and feel her whole careful ledger of a life fall out of balance by one warm entry. This is what was growing in the house when Cordelia Fanshrew came back, and this is what Eleanor had done in the March before that October which gave the lie its handle. The spring storm that year was the worst in 40 seasons, the great March gale. Half the roofs in Millthorpe stripped to the rafters, the school flooded, old Hodgett's chimney down through his one good room. The estate could not carry the repairs entire, not with the young Duke's last mortgage 2 years from discharge, and Eleanor watched her husband sit with the figures until midnight, subtracting and resubtracting, and watched what it cost him to conclude, in his mother's arithmetic, that the cottagers must wait for summer and patch with tarpaulin till then, and she said nothing, because she had already decided, walking back from Millthorpe in the wet with a child's spelling slate warping in her hand, what she was going to do. Her mother's legacy stood at some £400. Her mother's locket, gold, old-fashioned, heavy, with a curl of fair hair under the glass that was all Eleanor had of a woman dead since her 12th year, was valued by Mr. Solomon Gage of Harcaster, jeweller and discreet, at £31, and sold to him on the 4th of April for 30. The Duchess declining to haggle over her own mother with a delicacy Gage never forgot. She kept the chain. Chains can be worn without explanation. And through that spring and summer, by means of Mr. Pruitt, who asked one question, only one, "Does His Grace know?" "Your Grace." And receiving the answer, "His Grace is not to be troubled," never asked another, the money went out quietly into the estate under cover of the ordinary accounts, marked in the private column of her own pocketbook and nowhere else. New roofs at Millthorpe, 11 of them. The school floor relaid, the slates replaced. Hodgett's chimney rebuilt, and his floor, and, because she was there and the man wept, his father's clock mended. £30 of dead mother turned into dry children, and no one upstairs the wiser. And whoever would know Eleanor of Renfield in one line may take this one, that she considered it, in the strictest sense, an excellent bargain, and never once, even afterward, even at Kettlewick in the worst of the winter, recorded it as a loss. But money that moves leaves a wake, however quiet the water, and Cordelia Fanshawe had spent 20 years in the Marquess of Fanshire's house learning to read wakes. She saw what the county saw, a duchess oddly beloved in the cottages, repairs no one could quite account for, a merchant father in reduced circumstances 40 miles off, and she saw what the county did not, that the Duke of Renfield had a locked room at the centre of him, and that she, Cordelia, had been given the key to it 20 years ago and had never thrown it away. She did not invent a story. Invented stories can be disproved. She merely asked questions, at dinners, in gigs, on terraces, each one shaped like concern. Whether the dear Duchess's father was quite comfortable at Harcaster, whether Edmund found the estate accounts entirely transparent since, one understood, dear Pruitt no longer kept them himself. Whether it was true, one had heard it somewhere, that things, small valuable things, had been sold out of the district lately. She asked the Dowager the same questions, and the Dowager, who had waited 2 years for evidence that the merchant's daughter was reaching for the pocket, supplied doctrine where facts were wanting, and between the two of them, by October, the thing had a shape. Nothing was ever said to him directly. That was the art of it. It was only that by the night of the ball, the Duke of Renfield had been reminded, from 2 directions, in a dozen soft instalments, of everything he had ever been taught, that his father had been loved and stripped. That affection is the pick that opens the lock. That he could not 20 years ago afford the woman standing beside him, and that the woman across the room, wearing his mother's sapphires, which he had sent up to her that morning in the first open gift of his married life, and had been sick with the risk of it all day, was a merchant's daughter whose family wanted money, whose accounts were in her own hand, and whose kindness to his tenants was, perhaps, had he considered it, the most expensive smile of all. And Cordelia, watching him watch his wife, chose her moment with an engineer's eye, and said, lightly, behind her fan, the sapphires become her Renfield, how generous you are grown. One only hopes the generosity stays where it is given. But then, one hears such odd things carried out of Harcaster lately, I am sure none of it is true. And the locked room opened, and the frightened 19-year-old who lived in it looked out at the woman his whole silent house had begun to love, and reached for the only bolt he knew. The house went quiet, the way a clock goes quiet, not all at once, but tick by missing tick, so that a man may be some days understanding what it is he no longer hears. For the first week, the Duke of Renfield told himself, in his mother's voice, that he had done a necessary thing at last, and the words held up about as well as tarpaulin holds a March gale. He was proud, and he was frightened, and he had been publicly obeyed, which he discovered was a species of ruin no doctrine had prepared him for. There is no satisfaction in winning a point against an opponent who concedes everything, pays the bill entire, and leaves you alone in the counting-house with your victory. The sapphires had come back the very night, which he learned of only when his valet, wooden-faced, presented the case at his dressing-table as instructed, with her Grace's compliments, and the Duke stood holding it in his nightshirt for a long moment before he said, "Very good," which it was not. The ring he found himself, the following afternoon, in the estate office, where the servants had left everything untouched, as if the room were lying in state. He saw the great ledger open on the standing desk, and the small gold band sitting in the centre of October's page like a full stop, and he understood, as has been said, with perfect accuracy, because the language was one he knew. What he did next he did in secret, and it was the first honest work of his repentance, though he would not have called it that yet. He sat down in her chair, and he began to read the book. He read the whole year. Then he fetched the year before it, and read that. A man may fall in love with a woman's hand in a ledger as thoroughly as with her face at a window, and later, much later, the Duke himself would say that he had courted his own wife for the first time after she was gone, at a standing desk, by candle, entry by entry, reading her marginalia the way another man might read a letter. Because she was everywhere in that book, not in sums merely. In the third week of a bitter January, coals sent up to the Widow Marsh entered under sundries, sixpence, and beside it, in the small upright hand, she will not ask twice, see that it is not needed. Against the corn factor's revised reckoning, he believes a woman cannot carry figures overnight. He is mistaken. Memorandum, check his April against his November. And against the great March storm, page after page of it, the tarpaulin his own arithmetic had decreed, and then threaded through the ordinary accounts of April, May, June, so quietly that only a man reading with his whole soul would catch the pattern. Entries that balanced strangely, works that exceeded their provisions. 11 roofs where the estate had funded patching, a school floor, a chimney, a mended clock, and no debit anywhere to carry them. The estate had not paid for those roofs. He sat back in her chair at 2 a.m. with the candle guttering and the whole silent house above him, and said aloud, to nobody, in a voice Pruitt would not have recognized, then who paid? Mr. Pruitt, summoned next morning, stood before the desk he had served at for 40 years with his hat in his hands, and considered the question, and considered his instruction, his grace is not to be troubled, and concluded, with the fine casuistry of an honest man who has chosen his side, that his grace looked troubled enough already to satisfy the letter of it. Her grace paid, your grace, he said, out of her own legacy, as I understood it. I asked her the once whether you knew of it. She said you were not to be troubled. That would have been April. And then, because 40 years earns a man one liberty and he had been saving his, I have kept books under 3 Dukes of Renfield. I never, in my time, entered anything in them so good as what that lady put in, and never wrote down. The locket he traced within the fortnight, because grief with nothing to do becomes method, a discreet inquiry at Harcaster, then another, then Mr. Solomon Gage's shop, and the jeweller, who knew exactly who was standing in front of him, brought it out from the back in a twist of soft leather. Gold. Old-fashioned, heavy, a curl of fair hair under the glass. Sold the 4th of April for £30 by a lady who declined to haggle. The Duke of Renfield, who had restored 11,000 acres and could tell you what a civility cost, stood in a shop that smelled of whale oil and silver polish, holding £30 of his wife's dead mother, and did the sum at last in its true currency, and paid Gage his price without a word, and carried the locket home in his breast pocket like a conviction. It was in this season that the 2 truth-tellers found him. Lady Honoria Vane, His great-aunt, 81 years old and constructed entirely of whalebone and verdicts, arrived uninvited in the coldest week of December, and at dinner, on the second evening, having dismissed the footman with a look, addressed her great-nephew across the width of the cloth as follows. "I am told you instructed your wife in your own ballroom before the county to take nothing of yours. I am told she thereupon took nothing of yours, including, I now learn from my woman, who has it from the town, your name. She is calling herself plain Mrs. Winslow somewhere in the eastern part of the county, and keeping tradesmen's books for her bread. I have not come to scold you, Edmund. Scolding is wasted on the intelligent. They know already. I have come to tell you the one thing your mother's whole system never got round to, which is this. You did not believe Cordelia Fanshawe that night. Nobody believes Cordelia Fanshawe, least of all Cordelia Fanshawe. You believed your mother's catechism, which you have been frightened of since you were 6 years old, and you recited it over your wife in public to prove you had it by heart. Your father spent money. Edmund, you have spent a woman. Of the two of you, I begin to think him the better economist, for what he wasted could at least be got again at interest." And she returned to her partridge with the air of a judge who has cleared the list before dinner. But it was the child who did the deeper work, as it is generally the child. Georgiana, called Georgie, was 9 that winter, the orphan daughter of the Duke's cousin, deposited at Renfield 2 years before, with a trunk and a pony, and the general understanding that great houses absorb such children the way they absorb weather. It was the Duchess who had absorbed her. It was the Duchess who had taught her whist and the multiplication table, and how to speak to a horse you do not know, and since November the child had gone about the house with the stunned economy of movement of a creature whose weather has failed, asking her questions of the servants who could not answer them, until, on a black afternoon, shortly after 12th night, she presented herself in the library, where the Duke sat not reading beside the lamp he still, absurdly nightly lit, and stood before him, with her hands behind her back, and asked her question of the correct person at last. Uncle Edmund. "Foster says Aunt Eleanor went away because you told her to take nothing that was yours. Foster should mind the pantry," said the Duke. And then, because the child's eyes did not move, "Yes, that is what I said." Georgie considered this with the terrible impartiality of 9. "But everything was already yours," she said. "The house, and the carriages, and the sapphires. Betsy told me about the sapphires. She couldn't take nothing unless she went away, because there wasn't anything here that wasn't yours. Except her name. That was the only thing you ever gave her that was hers." The clock finished the silence for him. "So she gave it back," said the child, in the flat unanswerable voice of somebody working a sum and finding it prove, "because you told her to. Everyone did what you said, Uncle Edmund. Why are you angry with them?" And she made her small correct curtsy, having been taught it by the person under discussion, and left him alone with the lamp, which burned, as it had burned every night since June, for a reader who was 40 miles away, and reading, if she was reading at all, by tallow in a hired room under her own name. 40 miles away, in the market town of Kettlewick, where the Wool Road crosses the river, and the church clock has struck 4 minutes behind the true time since anyone living can remember, there lodged that winter, above the ironmongers in Bridge Street, a Mrs. Winslow, a quiet widow, or perhaps not a widow. The town never settled it, and she never assisted, who kept accounts. She had arrived in November in a hired gig with 1 trunk, 1 maidservant, and £41, and had taken the 2 rooms with the north light, and within a month the ironmonger, whose books had been amidden since his son went for a soldier, was telling the brewer that the Winslow woman had found him £11 a year he did not know he was losing, and within 2 months the brewer had her. And the corn chandler, and the carrier, and by Candlemas half the tradesmen's ledgers in Kettlewick, went up the stairs in Bridge Street in canvas sacks, and came down again ruled, reconciled, and fluent. At a shilling the hour, cash entered in her own pocket-book to the penny. She was, the town agreed, a mystery conducted with perfect openness. She went to church. She kept Betsy, which argued means, but she burned tallow, which argued none. Her linen was plain, and her speech was not. She wore a thin gold chain with no locket on it, and 1 gown of grey silk Sundays that the draper's wife priced across the aisle at more than the draper's shop, and she answered to Mrs. Winslow with an evenness that discouraged the second question, and she was, though not 1 soul in Kettlewick could have named it, entirely, scrupulously honest in the matter, because Winslow was her own name, her father's name, paid for by that decent broken man with everything he had, and it was the one piece of property in England to which the Duke of Renfield's instruction could not conceivably apply. She did not weep in Kettlewick. Betsy, who slept in the next room and would have heard, was asked once, years on, and said only that some nights the boards creaked a long time, walking, and that the candle went out late, and that in the morning the work went down the stairs correct to the farthing. Some griefs are carried that way, in walking and in work, with the accounts exact, because the accounts at least will balance if one makes them, and no more needs saying of that winter in front of strangers. Meanwhile, at Renfield, the season played out its last hands. Cordelia Fanshawe, who had engineered a vacancy, now moved, with the smooth confidence of a woman 20 years practised, to fill it, and therein miscalculated. For a locked room once opened does not always contain what the keyholder remembers storing there. She began to be at Renfield often, chaperoned by the Dowager's approval. She sat at his table in the place that was not offered but merely, somehow, occupied. She spoke of the Duchess kindly, always kindly, in the past tense, as one speaks of the recently and conveniently dead. Such a capable little person, one hoped she was comfortable wherever she had got to. And one evening in late January, judging the fruit ripe, she laid her hand on the Duke of Renfield's sleeve at his own fireside, and said, gently, "You look tired, Edmund. You have carried this house alone too long. It was always meant to be carried by 2 of the same kind." And the Duke looked down at the hand on his sleeve, white against the dark cloth, positioned to the inch, and found himself thinking, with a clarity that arrived like the striking of a clock, that in 2 years his wife had never once touched him for an audience, and that this woman had never once touched him without one. He did not make a scene. Scenes, he had learned from an authority, are a form of payment, and he had stopped paying. He removed her hand as he might have removed a leaf fallen on his sleeve, and said, in the flat carrying voice the county knew, "You were accurate 20 years ago, Cordelia, and I have thanked you longer than you deserve. I could not have afforded you. I find I cannot afford you now. The difference is that I am at last rich enough to know it." And he rang for her carriage with his own hand. She was in Bath by Lady Day, where she shortly married a nabob's widower's son, and was, by every account that travelled north, contentedly miserable and beautifully dressed, and we may leave her there with this one grace, that many years afterwards she was heard in the pump room, upon the Renfields being mentioned, to say into her cup, he was the only one of them I told the truth to, which was, in its way, and for her, very nearly repentance. His mother took longer, mothers do. The dowager, informed that Lady Fanshawe would not be received again, and shortly divining why, delivered the catechism entire, the smilers and the pockets, the merchant blood, the mercy of a clean escape, and her son heard her out standing, and then said, Madam, you taught me to count. I have finally done it. She put in 2 years, her whole fortune, her mother's locket, and every particle of her considerable genius, and she drew out one insult, publicly administered by me, at your feast to your satisfaction. No pocket in England was ever picked like that. We are the thieves in this account, you and I am going to spend the rest of my life restoring the property. The dowager removed that spring to the dower house at Harcaster Gate, where she lived to a great age, was civil at Glacial Range to her daughter-in-law at all family occasions, and was heard only once to pronounce upon the whole matter, at the christening with which this story ends, when she looked a long time at the child and said, She counts like my son. Let us hope she spends like her mother, which the family preserved, because it was as near to surrender as the doctrine ever came. All of which brings us to the 12th of February, and the county assembly at Harcaster, and the scene that is still told in that town on winter nights, with the details wrong and the heart of it exactly right. The assembly rooms were full, the Duke was present, which was remarked, for he had gone nowhere all winter, and midway through the evening, in the card-room, Sir Giles Mowbray, a florid baronet made confident by claret, offered to the table, with a wink toward the Duke, his condolences on the difficulty of keeping property safe. One heard the little Duchess had carried off half the plate to her father's people at Harcaster. They were sharp in the wool line, though never say he said so. What followed was not loud. Witnesses are unanimous on the point. The Duke of Renfield rose and asked the table's pardon for interrupting play, and then, in the voice of a man reading out figures at a vestry meeting, he laid the account before the room. That his wife had brought to Renfield a legacy of £400, her own in law, and had left with 41. That the difference stood at this hour in 11 Millthorpe roofs, a school floor, a rebuilt chimney, and a mended clock, and could be inspected by any gentleman with a horse. That she had sold her dead mother's locket to a jeweller in this town for £30 to roof his tenants while he, the Duke, was balancing his books, and that he had the jeweller's receipt in his pocket-book, where he now carried it, he found, in the place where other men carry miniatures. That on the last night of October he had, before witnesses, some of them present, instructed his wife to take nothing of his, and had been obeyed with an exactness he recommended to the reflection of every married man in the room. My wife took nothing of mine, said the Duke of Renfield, into a silence you could have entered in a ledger. I am the debtor in that house, gentlemen, the whole length of the account, and I am here tonight because my creditor is too fine to collect. If any man after this evening hears the matter told otherwise and lets it stand, he will explain the arithmetic to me personally. Sir Giles, I believe it was your deal. And he sat down and took up his cards, and his hands, Pruitt always insisted, having had it from a man at the table, did not shake, though the 13th trick went to Sir Giles unopposed. The Duke being occupied, the man said, in looking at something none of the rest of them could see. A duke humbling himself in a card-room does not stay in the card-room. It was in Kettlewick by the carrier on Thursday. It went up the stairs in Bridge Street inside the brewer's canvas sack between the malt account and the excise. Betsy heard it in the fishmonger's queue and brought it home scalding, and was made to repeat it twice, slowly, while her mistress stood at the north window with the winter light on her face, turning the chain at her throat with one finger exactly, Betsy said, as if she were carrying a figure from one column to another and wanted it right before she inked it. He came on a Tuesday, the last week of February, and he came correctly, which is to say he came as a petitioner and not as a duke. No carriage with arms on the door stood in Bridge Street. He rode alone, in a plain dark coat, stabled the horse at the Bell, and asked at the ironmonger's, bareheaded, whether Mrs. Winslow might receive a caller on a matter of accounts, and waited in the shop among the nails and hinges while the boy went up. She received him at the top of the stairs, in the plain front room with the north light and the table of ledgers, standing, composed, in grey wool with the chain at her throat. And for a moment neither of them managed anything at all, because 2 years of Thursdays had taught them to speak only through figures, and there were no figures for this. Then he said, "Thank you for receiving me," and she said, "The account books of Kettlewick are open to anyone, your grace," which was not warm, and was not meant to be, and he took it as a man takes the terms he has earned. What he said then, Betsy, listening frankly at the back room door with a duster for an alibi, preserved for the rest of her long life, and it is set down here as she gave it. He did not sit. He stood in the middle of the little room with his hat in his hands, and he said, "I have not come to explain myself. There is no explanation that is not an excuse, and you have had a lifetime of watching men make excuses to your father, and I will not add mine to the heap. I have come to say the thing itself, plainly, because you were owed it publicly, and I have done that, and privately, which is harder, and this is that. On the last night of October I stood in my own house beside a woman who flattered my fear, and across the room from a woman who had spent herself for 2 years making my fear unnecessary, and when the moment came to choose between them, I chose the fear, because I have lived with it longest, and I recited my mother's lesson over you like a schoolboy proving he has it by heart. It was not belief. I want that understood, not because it lessens it, but because it makes it worse. I did not believe for 1 hour that you had taken anything of mine. I said it because I was a coward, and cowardice in a man with power does not look like trembling. It looks like coldness, and it is the more contemptible of the two because it is applauded. You asked me for nothing in 2 years. I now know what you gave. I have read both books, yours and the one you kept in your own hand for my tenants, and I have stood in Gage's shop, and I am not come to buy anything back. Because none of it was ever for sale, that was only ever my way of seeing the world, and it was wrong, and it has cost me the single company in it that I cannot balance against anything. He stopped and turned his hat once in his hands, and finished, in the flat voice stripped now of everything but the Count. You took nothing of mine, Eleanor. You never once did. And I took 2 years of yours, and your mother's locket off your neck, and your name out of your mouth in front of 80 people. That is the whole account as I now hold it. I am not asking you to come back. I am asking what payment looks like, and I will meet it over whatever term you name at any interest, and if the answer is that the debt is not payable, I will go home and live in it, and keep your chair empty and your name good, and trouble you no further than one letter at each quarter day, so that you need never wonder whether it lasted. The room was quiet. The church clock struck the hour 4 minutes behind the true time, and neither of them smiled at it yet. That came years later. She looked at him for a long moment, the north light between them, and when she spoke it was in the voice Betsy called her figure's voice, level, unhurried, each word set down like ink. "You will want my conditions then, since you speak of terms." "I do," he said. "First, I will not be defended in occasions, Edmund. Occasions are performances. And I have seen you perform at the assembly. They tell me it was very fine. I require the other thing, the daily thing. My place kept ordinarily, as a matter of course, at your table, in your speech, in rooms I am not in, on days when there is no audience and nothing to be gained by it. If your mother slights me on a wet Tuesday in March, that is when it matters, not at feasts. Second, you will not require me to be grateful for justice. What you did at Harcaster and what you have said in this room is not generosity, it is the settling of an account, and I will not spend the rest of my life curtsying for restitution. When it is level, and we will not speak of the debt again, either of us, ever. I will not be married to a penance. Third, and here Betsy swore, the figure's voice failed by a fraction, 1 thread's width, no more. You will wait. Words are entries, Edmund. I have been reading your entries for 2 years, and they were beautiful, and I built a hope on them, and it broke in front of 80 people. I will believe the audit, not the prospectus. Go home, keep the books the way you say you now keep them, and time will tell us both. He bowed his head, and said accepted all 3, without negotiation, and then, because he was still, whatever else had changed, a man who closed an account correctly, may I write? At the quarter days, she said, you proposed it yourself. And then, at the door with his hat on and his hand on the rail, he stopped, and took from his breast pocket the small twist of soft leather, and did not hold it out, but laid it on the corner of the ledger table, and said, your mother's. Gage kept it for you. I only kept it warm. It is not a gift. It was never mine to give. And she looked at the little bundle and did not touch it, and said the sentence that the Duke of Renfield carried out of that room and through the whole of the following year like a lamp. Keep it. When I take something of yours again, I will take it from your hand, in front of everyone. What followed was the least dramatic and most difficult stretch of the whole business, which is to say, it was the proof. Through March, April, May, the Duke of Renfield did nothing remarkable whatsoever, and did it with a consistency that slowly astonished 3 parishes. Her chair stayed at the table, laid for, daily, the parish register at Millthorpe, where a curate's economy had entered the school repairs as by the grace of his grace, was corrected in the Duke's own hand to buy the Duchess of Renfield of her own fortune, and initialled. He said the Duchess in rooms she was not in, easily in the present tense, as a matter of course, until the county stopped holding its breath around the word. The quarter-day letters went out, Leady Day, Midsummer, and were, Betsy reported, read more than once, being neither pleased nor poetry, but exact, dry, faithful accounts, her roofs holding, her school, Hodgett's clock-keeping time, the lower hay carrying its first full hay crop in living memory, and at the foot of each, above the signature, the same closing entry, unvaried, the lamp is lit. But it was the child, as the Duchess herself always maintained, who closed the account. In the first week of September, Lady Honoria Vane's travelling coach stopped in Bridge Street, on the pretext of a disputed legacy, her ladyship's legacies being always in dispute. She saw to it, and out of the coach with her came Georgie, who had petitioned, schemed, and finally simply announced her way into the journey, and who stood in the middle of the plain front room turning her bonnet in her hands and answered the Duchess's questions about the pony and the multiplication table, and Betsy's sister's baby, with a strange scrupulous care, as though each answer were being weighed. And then, in the small silence while tea was poured, delivered, unprompted, in the flat unanswerable voice of somebody who has worked the sum and finds it prove the finding she had crossed 40 miles to file. He lights the lamp every night, in the library window. Aunt Honoria says lamps are dear, and he should be ashamed, but she says it in her nice voice. I asked him once why he lights it when nobody reads there any more, and he said the stairs are treacherous in the dark. But he sits with it, Aunt Eleanor, all the way till the clock does 11. You can't see the stairs at all from that chair. I checked. The Duchess of Renfield set down the teapot and was still for the length of one breath, the same length exactly, Betsy always said, as on the last night of October, as though the 2 moments were the 2 ends of a single held note. Then she said, "Thank you, Georgiana, that is what I needed. One should never close a quarter on an estimate." She was home before Michaelmas. She came, at her own instruction on an ordinary Thursday, in the gig she hired herself from the Bell, up the long avenue between the limes just turning and the Duke of Renfield, who had been given one day's notice by a letter of 2 lines, met her not at the great door with the staff drawn up, which he had wanted and known better than to want, but alone, bareheaded. At the turn where the road comes out of the trees and the house first shows itself, the exact spot, though he never learned it, where a woman in a hired gig had once pressed the back of her hand to her mouth for the space of 3 heartbeats. He handed her down himself. Neither of them made a speech, they had both signed already. What he said was, "The books are in a shocking state. Madam Pruitt's eyes are worse, and my hand was never good." What she said was, "Then we had better go in. Edmund, Thursday's accounts, and the first ball at Renfield Hall after the Duchess came home is where this story keeps its promise, and the county keeps the scene the way churches keep glass. 80 guests again, the chandeliers all lit, the dowager glacially present, Honoria enthroned by the fire, Georgie permitted an hour past her bedtime by treaty. And before the first set, before the whole assembled room, the Duke of Renfield crossed the floor to his wife, carrying the flat leather case, and opened it. And it held the Renfield sapphires with her mother's locket lying among them on its old chain, mended, and he did not clasp anything about her neck as though claiming her, but held the case out flat on his 2 open hands, within reach, an offer with no grip in it, and said, in the carrying voice the county knew, 5 words, and they were not the old 5. "Take everything of mine, Eleanor." And the Duchess of Renfield looked at the case and at the man, and took, first before 80 witnesses, in front of everyone, from his hand the locket, and put it on, and the room, which had been holding its breath for a year, breathed. They had 4 children, which surprised the county, and did not surprise Betsy. The eldest was a daughter, and at her christening the dowager made her single pronouncement, and it was preserved. Every year on the last night of October for the rest of their lives, before the first set of the autumn ball, the Duke crossed the floor with the flat case on his open hands and said his 5 words. And his wife took something from it in front of everyone, the sapphires 1 year, the locket most years, and 1 year very late, when his hair was white and the case shook a little on his palms. Nothing but his hand itself, which she held through the whole first set, while the county pretended not to weep. Their children, who told the story to their children, always ended it the same way, with the entry their mother was said to have written on no page anyone ever found, and the family repeated until it became the motto the old doctrine never was. She took nothing of his until he learned to hold it out on open hands, and then she took everything, beginning, as she had ended, with his name.